Judge Strayhorn, it's so nice to see you at Chicago State today. And we want to talk about your experience with the Tuskegee Airmen. But before that, I'd like you to talk about your background and your education, your childhood, and then we'll lead into your experience with the Airmen. Can you tell us?
I'm almost a Chicagoan by birth. By that I mean that my folks brought me here from Mississippi when I was 5, and my brother Wilbur was 3, and we first lived over on 37th and Cottage. That was back in 1927, long before that area there became the Ida B. Wells housing complex. And that was our first residence in Chicago. My great uncle owned a restaurant at 35th and State, and my mother worked in that restaurant as a waitress. My dad got a job at the Pullman Works in their paint shop. And my brother and I, our first school here in Chicago was at Coleman Elementary School. It's still there at 35th, just west of Cottage Grove. It's still there. And that's where I started my kindergarten. I was there for about a year, and then the family moved to 50th and Prairie. And I was transferred from Coleman to Burke Elementary School. Burke is still in existence. That's now at 54th Place and King Drive. Back in the days when I was going there, King Drive was called South Park Avenue. And that's where I took the rest of my elementary schooling until I graduated from elementary and went into high school. After graduating from Burke, I went to Tilden Technical High School,
which is also still up and running.
Which is still running, except that now Tilden is co-ed. When I went there, it was all boys. So when I went back and visited Tilden several years back, seeing young ladies in the hallways that I had walked at first was a strange sight, but I got used to it after I'd been there for a while. Mm-hmm. But when I went there, it was an all-boys school, and there were only, when I entered Tilden, I guess this was in 1932, there were at the most 40 black students out of an enrollment of probably 5,000.
And when you went back?
When I went back, there was probably 90, better than 90% of black,
sure,
male and female, and the rest, it could have been higher than 90%, were Hispanics and other races.
I bet the standards have changed somewhat as well.
Well, I understand that the school is getting back to the point where it was on the educational scale when I was there. And I understand that they've turned their downturn back, and now they're back on the upgrade. And
that's always good news.
The educational level is going back up now.
How about a skill or a trade? Were you proficient at any certain kind of a trade or skill?
No, I went to Tilden because that's where all of my best buddies were going. When we graduated from elementary school, and we had a tendency to hang together the group that grew up around my area, the 50th and Prairie. There were 3 or 4 of us that hung together, and we traipsed from Burke right on into Tillman. All of us got in, and all of us did relatively well.
That's good.
In high school.
That would be called a gang now, probably.
Yes, we were. Well, gangs always existed, except back in those days, the gangs were not lethal as they are now.
Yeah,
Boys are always going to congregate together. That's the nature of growing up.
Group,
yes.
Now,
And but we weren't trained, and we weren't encouraged, and we didn't involve ourselves in lethal kinds of activities. The fights, and we had fights, were with fists and rocks and sticks.
and those were the days when, if you were seen doing any of this, you knew that whoever saw you would go home and tell your parents.
No. If we were seen, we were immediately punished by whoever saw us, and then we knew that we were going to get another punishment because that person that saw us and punished us was going to tell our parents, and we were going to get punished again.
The good old days.
There was no such thing as, how dare you touch my child. Back in those days, the neighborhood was really a village.
Raising the children.
It was really a village, and everybody in the neighborhood had a hand in the raising of the kids in that particular neighborhood.
And look
to
what
the
they,
extent
look what they produced.
of corporeal punishment if necessary. And neighbors took care of one another back in those days. You would always find some old grandmother or grandfather sitting in the front room of the apartment looking out the window, and if they saw someone strange, the next thing you know, the police were coming, because they were not loath to call the police if they saw a stranger in the neighborhood and that stranger was acting in a strange manner.
So they served as surrogate parents as well.
Surrogate parents, surrogate security, everything.
It wasn't wonderful then?
Yes, yes.
How was your family status? Were you very poor? Were you average for the rest of the so-called colored families, as we were called back in those days?
No, we weren't.
Well-to-do?
We weren't well-to-do, but we weren't poor.
So just average for...
Average. We, back in those days, they had welfare. We never were on the welfare rolls in our family. But insofar as having wealth, no, we weren't rich. But we were comfortable.
After those years, after you graduated from Tilden, did you have an idea in your mind that what you might want to make your life's work?
Well, my mom had at an early age impressed upon my brother and me that we were going to go to college. So that was a given. I knew I was going to college somewhere. And when I graduated from Tilden, again, I am following down the road with a friend. I had a very, very close friend at Tilden that I looked up to. He was a little older than me, and he was the captain of the basketball team, co-captain of the basketball team, the co-captain of the team that won the city championship for Tilden back in 1931 or thereabouts. Walter Black. And Walter, when he graduated, I went down to the University of Illinois in Champaign. My first choice for college was Wisconsin, University of Wisconsin. But I couldn't raise the out-of-state surcharge that Wisconsin put on out-of-state non-Wisconsin resident fees for out-of-state students, and I couldn't raise that, so I had to go to the University of Illinois down in Champaign, and that's where Walter was. Guess what the tuition was at that time?
Oh, I can't
Full
imagine.
tuition. This was in 1936, and the tuition was $35 a semester.
A semester?
And Illinois at that time, I think they're still on the semester system. So we had 2 semesters a year, so that's tuition of $70 plus our lab fees and books.
Do you mean $35 per credit hour?
No, I mean
You mean
$35 full
tuition?
For
Chicago
a semester.
State, did you hear that? Isn't that amazing?
And I worked because by that time my mother and father were divorced, and I worked carrying newspapers and working in the consumer grocery store, which was bought up by Kroger and became Kroger Consumers. And I worked there. I was an usher at the old Regal Theater. And amongst all of that, I
there was a
saved
Regal
enough.
Theater in Champaign, or do you mean when you were
No,
home
Regal
here?
Theater at home here.
Okay.
And
that was on 47th and
47th
King
and King Drive, and I got enough money together to pay my own tuition. I didn't have to bother my mom about that.
Excuse me, 47th and South Park.
Yes, 47th and South Park, now King Drive.
Now King Drive.
And that's where I went to school, and I did my.
And did you declare a major early on, or?
Oh, before I declared a major, I had a rude awakening, because my first semester down at Champaign, that was the first time that I had been away from home,
Yes.
unsupervised, no mother to tell me
you
that I
what to
couldn't
do.
go out at night, and I had a ball.
Until finals.
I ran all night and would use the lecture hall as my sleeping post.
Oh my goodness.
And I had a friend there too, Arnold Cisco. He became a Tuskegee Airman, a flyer, and he was killed after the war, flying back to Tuskegee from Chicago. But Arnold and I were roommates and running buddies, and we ran all night. Now, if you ask me, what did you find to do down there in that little town that it couldn't have at that time have had any more than 15,000 residents? I don't know, but
Was it segregated?
Yes, but we found something to do. We were trying to go all night, not studying, running around, carousing. First time free for me and for him. And I took 16 and a half hours, and at the end of the semester, when the grades came out, I passed a 2-hour course in hygiene. And don't ask him how I got a C in hygiene and an E in every other subject, including PE. How do you flunk physical ed?
No, because you were taking your phys ed outside of classes.
I got a C, and everything else was a failure. And I got a letter saying, "Dear Mr. Strayhorn, we regret to tell you that you will not be permitted to re-enroll for the spring semester because of your failing educational accomplishment. You may reapply for admission for the fall semester next September, and your application will be given due consideration.
Rude awakening, wasn't it?
And they sent me home.
Oh.
Now the hard part for me was
Facing?
not so much flunking. How am I going to tell my mother that I have been kicked out of school?
Oh.
And
That was a long ride home, wasn't it?
I ruminated over that. I thought about it. I pontificated with myself and I did it always, and the only way that I could finally end up with telling her I got kicked out of school. I couldn't find any other way of coating the apple. And what I thought was going to be a tragic occurrence for me turned out not to be tragic at all, because she asked me, well, what are you going to do? And I said, well, I want to go back. And she says, well.
And that was when you grew up, wasn't it?
Yes. So when I went back, I had a hard row to hoe, because it took me the rest of those 4 years to bring my grade point average up to somewhere decent, a C minus, because of all those failures that I had that first semester. But I did.
That's called learning the hard way, isn't it?
Yes. But that gave me also a lesson in time management and self-discipline.
Well, obviously you were smart enough to learn from your mistake. You got a lot out of that the hard way.
Well, I don't know whether it was smart.
Well, you just said you learned time management.
Well,
for
yes,
example.
but I just didn't want to go through that ordeal again. But what it did do, and I really didn't get over that feeling of inferiority in terms of intellect until I went into service. It gave me a full-blown, massive inferiority complex, because not only had I flunked out of school, but here I didn't weigh 100 pounds. I was the smallest fella in the fraternity house. I wanted to be a big football star. I couldn't play football because of my size. I didn't think I was good enough to run track. I didn't have a father who would have encouraged me maybe to go into wrestling. And so therefore I passed the possibility of being on the wrestling team. And so I had that, which I carried within me. I don't think I showed it too much, but I certainly felt it inwardly. And I didn't get over that, really, until I went into service. And once I went into service, and once I went through officer candidate school and came out with my commission and had to undertake the responsibility of seeing after the welfare of men that were under me and seeing that they were cared for, then I didn't feel so bad about myself.
You overcame what you felt was a deficiency.
Yes.
But you overcame it on your own.
Well,
What motivated you from college into the military? Was that the time that
the draft.
The draft. Okay. Okay.
At that time.
And about going into OCS, into officer candidate school.
Well, at that time when I went into service, which was in 1941, when I graduated, then I got married 3 months after I graduated, and at that time the selective service was in effect, and that selective service called for all able-bodied male American
Was this after
citizens
December 7th?
to be inducted into the armed forces and serve for a 1-year period.
It was just 1 year then?
Yes.
Oh, I didn't know that.
And so I was expecting that I was going to be drafted because my number was close up to the point where it was going to be called. And so I worked. I was married. I worked again at Kroger, except I was working full time now. And I was awaiting my draft notice. And it came October 15th, 1941. 1 year to the day after the passage of the Selective Service Act. And I was called, and I went down to the reception center on Van Buren here in Chicago, and on October 15th, and was sworn in, and they put me on a train and sent me to Battle Creek, Michigan. And as I reflect back on it, the authorities must have known that we were close to war, because when I got to the reception center there at Battle Creek, our basic training took only 21 days. We didn't even
isn't it usually 6 weeks?
Yes. It's usually, well, now that we're not in service, it's 90 days. But ours was done in 21 days. We didn't even get out onto the rifle range, which is one of the basic fundamentals of basic training, where the soldiers are taught the use of the rifle and how to care for it and how to shoot it, and we didn't even get out on the rifle range. And after that 21-day period, you asked me how it was that I happened to end up a Tuskegee Airman. We were told that we were going to be shipped out to various military bases, and amongst the bases that were mentioned was Tuskegee Air Force Base, and we were told that this was going to be the place where blacks were being trained to fly in the military. And
was it still considered the experiment then?
Oh yes, that's what it was called. But we weren't told it was an experiment. We were just told that this is where they were going to be training black flyers. And I was given the opportunity, and I selected to go there. And in early November, I, along with 44 others from Battle Creek, were selected to go down to Tuskegee, and we became the first troops on that base. We got there before anyone else.
Really?
As a matter of fact, they hadn't completed the barracks when we got there, so we had to stay in tents down by the creek there in Battle Creek, and
in Tuskegee.
If anybody in Tuskegee, and if anybody tells you that Alabama is not cold in November, then you tell them to come see me, because it was cold. And we had wood-burning stoves, and the wood that they gave us to burn was uncured wood. It was wet wood.
And damp, okay.
And therefore it made a lot of smoke, but not much fire. And the smoke sooted up the chimney, and we'd have to send somebody up on top of the tent every morning to take off the spark deflector because we were living in tents that had untreated tarpaulins at that time, and the sparks would get on this untreated tarp and burn the tops up, burn the tents up. And so we had to keep the spark deflectors on to keep the sparks from coming out. But in order to get a draft, we'd have to send someone up to clean out that sooty spark deflector every morning in that cold temperature, so that we could have a fire started and have the tent reasonably warm when we got up at 6 o'clock for reveille. So that was
an experience.
That's where we began. That's where I began my experience.
And that toughened you up for real war, didn't it? It's almost like living in the trenches.
Yes, and that contingent of troops became the first military police detachment for the base, and I was the first sergeant.
For goodness sake. Were any of your comrades there, or did any of those comrades there become Chicagoans?
One of the fellas that was in that group lived right next door to me
in later years?
Before we were inducted at 52nd in Michigan.
And who was that?
His name was Joe Jerry Lewis. And I'm going to see him in a couple of months. He's now living down in Tulsa, Oklahoma. And
so he's not in the Dodo chapter, though?
No, he's a member of the Dodo chapter.
He is?
He pays his dues through the Dodo chapter, but he lives in Tulsa.
Well, of course, you will give him our regards.
I sure will. And I'll be seeing him when I go down to go to Fort Sill, Oklahoma for the reunion of my field artillery officer candidate class.
Tell us a little bit about that, the officer candidate school. What was your experience
Well,
there?
after getting to Tuskegee and after getting the detachment set up as a military police detachment, we got notice of the existence of various officer candidate schools. They had officer candidate schools going on for the infantry at Fort Benning, Georgia, for the field artillery at Fort Sill, Oklahoma, for the Army Air Force. I don't remember where that was, for the Signal Corps out in one of the bases out east. All the different